Okay, I'm going to get straight in while people continue to come in. Hi, Janice. So there's quite a bit just to get through. As usual, I'm going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, just bring you up to speed with quite a bit that's been happening, and also obviously hear your questions, thoughts, and discussion. We can have a discussion. The first thing to say is that it's been quite a week for the Substack community in a number of ways. The first, we just passed 62,000 members as of last night, which is enormous. I mean, the growth rate at the moment is huge, and I think partly that's a reflection of the Labour government here in the UK, just how wildly unpopular it is, and people are looking for very strong opposition to that. The second reason, I think, is in the aftermath of the Trump victory, now has complete control of all levers, all levels of the American political system. It's got Congress and the White House. I think that reflects a lot of the things that we've been arguing. I think we had a great US election. Everything that was written on the Substack that we were talking about has been validated by the events. We said from the very beginning Kamala Harris would be a total disaster for the Democrats. We said from the very beginning Trump would win a landslide. We said from the very beginning he'd realign his electorate. He'd do really well among Hispanic, Latino voters. And we said from the very beginning that he would make inroads into new groups of voters. So all of that stuff has really happened. And the election for me, I think, was really important because it's given me more confidence in my analysis of what's happening in global politics. Because sometimes when you're caught off guard by an election result that doesn't go the way you think, you have to reevaluate where you are. But America, I think, is really important. I was listening to a podcast between Peter Thiel, who was one of the first guys in big tech to support Donald Trump in 2016, and Barry Weiss, who runs the Free Press, another big Substack. And Peter made a really interesting point that I referenced in the Substack this morning. He said, had Trump lost this election, then 2016 would have been seen as the outlier. It would have been seen as the freak election result in a continued dominance of liberal left politics. But because Trump won the election, 2020 will now be seen as the freak outlier in a world in which the liberal dominance is now coming to an end. And Peter, I've had dinner with him. I think he's a really, really smart guy, obviously, given the number of companies that he has invested in and sold, from PayPal to, I think he's one of the early investors in SpaceX. And it also got me thinking that, I'm going to write about this over the next week, what I think we're about to witness over the next 4 or 5 years with America and Trump is the start of a completely new cultural zeitgeist in the West. Now, what I mean by that is what we're going to see over the next 4 or 5 years are a lot of things that are going to be normalized and legitimized that we can't really think about at the moment. I'll give you an example. By the time we get to 28, 29, the idea of mass deportations will be normalized. Trump and Vance will do that. They will deport illegal migrants from America. That will have an impact on the debates here in Britain and Europe. Deportations will become a viable, legitimate policy. Reconfiguring, completely reforming the state will become a completely normal, legitimate policy. The appointment of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who are going to oversee a new Department of Government Effectiveness, or DOGE, is going to be a game changer for Western democracies, not just America. Because what Trump has recognized is what actually people like Liz Truss have recognized since losing power. I was at an event with Liz Truss this week, and I don't agree with everything that Liz Truss did in office and the way she went about it. But her and Trump are actually now saying something remarkably similar, which is, if you want to solve the second order problems in Western democracies, if you want to solve mass uncontrolled immigration, if you want to strengthen the borders, if you want to push back against woke ideology, if you want a better economy with lower tax, more dynamism, more prosperity, then you need to deal with the first order problem. not the second order problem. The first order problem is the state. We have a state that has been captured ideologically, philosophically, that's been hijacked. Government agencies have been politicized, and they are serving the interests of people who are pursuing an ideological agenda. Now, what Trump has realized with Musk and Ramaswamy is you can't go back to 2016 and try and do what he did in the face of a hostile state. You have to completely reconfigure the state. So Trump is now asking not just for 10,000 appointments to the bureaucracy, but he's pushing for 40,000. Now, if you look at, say, the UK, if you become prime minister in the UK, you at most can appoint about 100 people, special advisors. Completely different situation. So there's going to be a fascinating proof of concept. What I'm saying is what very few people have yet recognized, which is with Trump 2, the cultural zeitgeist in Western democracies is about to completely and utterly change. We are going to have proof of concept on a whole range of policies, and very few people, I think, in large parts of the West, have realized the significance of what's about to unfold. So it's given me a lot more confidence in my analysis of the situation. It also goes to show as to why any agenda at changing the status quo has to start with how do you reform the state? How do you reform the state? And as I said, and I'll come on to this in a minute, as I said in a recent speech, if you are part of this Substack community and you broadly agree with what I say, or even if you don't, the one thing that differentiates our community from a lot of others is, as I've said before, we have a fundamental different view of power. I view power, the true source of power, legitimacy, and authority, is lying with the people, with popular sovereignty. I think the forgotten majority are the people that should be prioritized. Most of the people in the elite class who have now been discredited by the events in America and across Europe will soon be discredited by events in places like Germany that I wrote about this morning. They hold a view of power that is elite-based. They think power rests with elites and that the people are an inconvenience, or at worst, are a danger to democracy. So it's a completely different conception of power. I think those of us who pursue a vision of power based on popular sovereignty are about to be validated over the next 5 to 10 years. As I wrote this morning, this isn't just about American Trump. This is about France. This is about Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella. This is about Germany, the alternative for Germany, where in February, the German system is going to have a big shock because the AfD is already averaging around 20%. Germany is moving to the right in terms of public opinion, in terms of its positioning around these issues. It's also about Italy, it's about Sweden, it's about the Netherlands, and it's about the UK, which I'll come to in a minute. The national populist revolt, which I think really began actually in the 1980s, and I'm going to write a long piece on this at some point. But basically what happened is this revolt that began in the 80s has gradually been getting stronger and stronger through the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, and has now got to such a point that these parties are on the cusp of taking power, like in Austria, where they won the election for the first time ever. They finished first while campaigning for a radical change from the status quo. I think it's only a matter of time until Le Pen or Bardella take over France, and Sweden and other countries that were historically invested in the elite consensus have now fundamentally changed their position. So the national populist revolt is getting stronger and stronger. And the realignment that has pushed Trump into office, I think that realignment is going to continue. Now, which brings me to Britain. Over the last week, apart from reaching 62,000 subscribers from 170 countries, I also spoke at 2 events, Reform Party events. Now, I should say at the outset, I'm not a Reform Party member, but I don't think it's a secret that I share many of the views that Reform are pushing, particularly around how we change how we secure our borders, how we deal with migration, how we slash regulation, tax, all of that. I don't think it's a secret as to where I am politically, but I'm not a Reform Party member. But I agreed to speak at the conference in Wales. Let me just tell you something, right? Because you'll see the speech online. I sent it out on the stack. The energy at this conference was unreal. It was off the charts. So they mobilized like 1,000 people in Newport. in looking ahead at the 2026 Welsh Assembly elections. This is going to be the next big revolt in British politics, by the way. What happens in Wales? Now, I know you don't often think political rebellions of Wales, but trust me, Wales is where the action is. And what you're going to see is the Reform Party really challenge Labour and the Tories implied in a really big way. Reform, I think, are already comfortably ahead of the Conservatives in the polls. They're going to be challenging Labour. And this as well is going to give us proof of concept, because if Reform do well in Wales, it's a pretty good sign that at 28, 29, they're going to basically decimate Labour across Wales, the Red Wall, Northern England, while also bearing down on the Tories in coastal towns and the southern shires. So you're seeing that realignment come together. So I turned up at this conference at the Celtic Manor resort. I spoke just before Nigel Farage, and I mean, this is a revolution, basically. I mean, the energy was through the roof. People were really up for an alternative to the old parties. And then the next day, we drove around to Exeter to speak at the Southwest Regional Conference, where again, I mean, a massive venue, filled to the brim, energy through the roof, different audience from Wales, a bit more rural, just a little bit more, it's probably a bit small c conservative. Wales felt a bit more like something's going to explode here any minute. It's a real political revolution. But the numbers that Reform are mobilizing, I was told they now have 96,000 members and are about to pass 100,000, which basically means they're about 10 or 15,000 behind the Conservatives. So I think over the next 12 months, you're going to see Reform have more members than the Conservatives, and probably finishing ahead of the Conservatives in a lot of areas at the local elections in 2025 and at the Welsh elections in 2026. So it does feel as though there is enormous momentum that is starting to kick in. And if you look at the issues that are now coming, and this brings me on to some other progress this week, you might remember a couple of weeks ago, I said, I'm so fed up with the status quo and with Labour lying to people about information, misleading people, that I started the national campaign for information on how immigration is changing our country. And we joined with the 5 Reform MPs and sent a letter to Keir Starmer demanding basically some answers. Now, for 2 weeks, it was like complete silence. It was like crickets, didn't hear anything. And then everything started going viral online. Now, if you're on Twitter and X and you've been following this campaign, you will have seen that myself, Nigel Farage, Rupert Lowe, among others, Lee Anderson, have been constantly bashing this point about, if you're so confident about mass immigration, we want the data. We want the data on welfare claims by nationality and immigration status. We want arrest rates and imprisonment rates and reoffending rates by nationality and immigration status. We want tax credits, tax information. We want housing and accommodation costs. We want more regular updates on how our country is changing and so on. And this isn't to say anything bad about the people coming to Britain. I've always said I have no problem with a small amount of high skill migration from culturally compatible nations, from nations that share our values. But I mean low levels, small numbers. What I'm completely opposed to is this mass, uncontrolled, low skill, low wage, extreme policy of mass immigration, which is why if we get the data and we get the information, the whole case for this policy will fall apart. It will completely fall apart. And after going viral on Twitter and X and piling pressure, and interestingly, after pointing out to Labour, in fact, I CC'd Keir Starmer in, I said, if you don't want to share this data, that's fine. But I'm pretty sure the Red Wall in 2025 and 26 is going to want to know how the country is changing. So it's up to you. Do you want us to be able to go into the Red Wall and say, look, Keir Starmer doesn't even care? Then we get a letter. We get a letter from the Minister of Border Security. Apparently, we've got secure borders. News to me. The Minister of Border Security, Angela Eagle. And I'm not going to say too much because the Reform Party are going to put an official response out. But what I will say exclusively for you guys who are supporting our Substack and in this chat is that they have delivered a wholly inadequate response to our request for information and data. And we are not going to stop talking about it because this issue really matters to British people. It really matters to British taxpayers. And it really matters to British families who are having to pay the costs of this extreme policy. So, we're not going anywhere anytime soon. And to underline the point today, to keep the pressure up, I've just released all of our polling for the campaign, which you'll find on my X, on my Twitter account. And we did a survey of 2,000 British adults, representative sample. And we just said, look, do you support or oppose all of these different bits of data being released? And what do you find? Shock, horror. Most people consistently, large majorities, want this data, want this information to be released. Now, look, this is just one campaign in a wider picture. I'm not only looking at this, we're looking at the broader failures of the policies in our country. But the reason we're zooming in on this is to try and explain to people that you do not have an honest, transparent government. You have a government that is basically gaslighting the rest of the country, ignoring what voters are asking for on what is, by the way, the number one issue facing Britain today. Immigration is the number one issue. According to voters in the polls, that's their top concern. So let's be honest with people. Let's get the information out there. Let's have a reasonable conversation about how our country is changing. Okay. That's why I'm pursuing it. That's why I'm not letting go of it. That's why I've pulled in these MPs and we've got a real campaign going because there is serious momentum behind us at the moment. And the other thing, just before coming out to questions and ask me anything, and just put the questions in the box if you do want to ask me something. The piece this morning, I think the reason I'm trying to step back from Trump and trying to look at what's happening across Europe is because I think what we're going to see over the next couple of years is going to shock a lot of people. I think we're going to see this continued rise of national populism. We're going to see these parties doing really well in different Western democracies. There's going to be a lot of collaboration and discussion between them. Can't go into too much detail, but I'm meeting people connected to Trump's campaign in about 10 days. It's going to be interesting. I want to kind of learn and reflect and see what they're doing around some of the issues on the border, removing critical race theory from institutions, radical ideologies. And for the first time, I haven't really had a chance to express this since the US election, but for the first time in quite a long time, I am really optimistic. I really am, because I think it's easy to get very gloomy and depressed about the state of the world. But I think, as I explained, I had a debate with a Corbynista on GB News this week, a guy called James Schneider, very interesting guy, kind of classic New Left, private school, Winchester, Oxford, but completely disconnected from the average voter. And you can watch the debate online. It's on YouTube. It was it was pretty lively. I don't think it was close, but we got into this debate, and I was saying, look, it's going to take some time, but the woke left have to understand now, like they've lost. They have lost this. They've lost the room. They've lost voters. The policies might still be there for now, but as I say, within 5 years, the DEI agenda is going to be toast. Trump is going to root that out. CRT in schools and universities, it's going to go. It's going to be completely stripped out. We're not going to have the elite radical minority telling our kids that little boys can become little girls and little girls can become little boys. Gender ideology is toast. Trump's going to root all of that out. I kind of joked to somebody recently, maybe Trump should offer asylum to people fleeing Keir Starmer's government. But all of these ideas are going to cross the pond, and they're going to be picked up by all of the parties and people who are going to be doing really well as we go through 2025 to 2030. So before I come to questions and discussion, just want to reaffirm and restate, I am all in for the next 5 years. I'm all in. I'm part of this realignment. I'm going to keep pushing, going to keep challenging, going to keep calling stuff out, because the energy I saw at these events on Friday and Saturday was insane, completely off the charts. There's something happening out there. Remember, during the election campaign, we wrote a piece, there is something happening out there. When you see it in the real world, I mean, it's crazy. People are so angry, they're frustrated, and they are desperate for change. So let's try and have a conversation about some of that. Let me get into some of the comments. I'm just going to flip right up to the start. How can we protect free speech? In the beginning, well, one of the things we could do, the Free Speech Union, well, first, two things. Firstly, we need to emulate and absorb and adopt the policies on protecting and promoting free speech in the universities, which Trump and Vance are going to bring into play. I've sent them our Higher Education Free Speech Act, which we brought forward in the UK. Bridget Phillipson and Labour have tried to get rid of that. They're going to court, I think, next week or the week after, and they're being taken to court on that. That's just the universities. What we need also, my view, we need to completely strip out the Orwellian stuff in our society. Non-crime hate incidents have to go for a start. All of that Orwellian stuff, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of it, all those policies that limit free speech, we want them off the books. It's a radical political agenda being used to stifle free speech and impose censorship. It's not gonna happen. Stephen says, I'm hearing that they're going to try and imprison Marine Le Pen. Is there any truth to that? Yes, as far as I'm aware, there is a campaign underway to try and imprison Marine Le Pen. And I think there's also going to be a campaign to ban the Alternative for Germany. But as I said in the piece this morning, this is like Trump. They threw everything at Trump. They called him a Nazi. They put him in legal case after legal case. They even tried to kill him, and he kept on coming. And if you look at the history of Europe, when you ban political parties, when you try and shut down populists, it doesn't really make a difference at all. It doesn't really change the underlying dynamics. These movements will keep on coming and coming so long as liberals refuse to deal with the underlying issues around mass migration, border security, and the denigration of our nation states. And even if, to be frank, they were to take Marine Le Pen off the board, there's now a successor in place. There is a movement in place. And I think, by the way, there's some lessons for Britain there too. I think there has to be much more thought and consideration given to generational turnover. Anne-Marie says, I think I might move to Wales. Anne-Marie, funny story. I think I might be in Wales come 28, 29, but more on that later. David, be careful. A continued emphasis on the populist revolts might scare the liberal left horses. What do you think about Matthew Parris's complaint in The Spectator about your use of the word the elite? Well, Matthew's said two interesting things about me recently. One is a complimentary remark regarding my potential future role in challenger politics, and the other is he doesn't like the word elite. Well, I'm sorry, there is a new elite in this country, and if you've read my last book, you'll know who belongs to that new elite. They tend to dominate the important institutions, the most influential institutions. They tend to have gone to the same universities, the same schools. They share the same values. They pursue the same policies. They pursue the same vision of Britain that is basically consistent with their own worldview. And at best, they represent 15 to 20%. Matthew Parris is part of that elite. Tim Montgomery is part of that elite. William Hague is part of it. David Aronovich is part of it. They might think they have different views about the settlement in this country, but they all basically agree with the liberal consensus. I mean, they might sit around stroking their chins saying, well, we're different from one another on XYZ, but they all share basically the consensus in this country that is represented by 15 to 20% max, and which has no interest in representing the forgotten majority. And that's why I get it from all sides. I get it from the centre-left members of the new elite, and I get it from the centre-right members of the new elite, because disruptors are seen as a threat to their position. But yeah, absolutely, there's a member of the elite, and Matthew Paris is in it. I mean, don't forget, this was a guy who went down to Clacton for a day trip and suddenly decided that he was going to denigrate the people of Clacton, and I quote, the people who are going nowhere. That's what he said in 2014, the people who are going nowhere. Well, now, those people are in the House of Commons represented by Nigel Farage, and actually it looks like their revolt is going somewhere. I mean, this is what happens when you deride people as garbage, as bigots. And it's interesting, John McTernan, the Labour Party advisor, I'm not sure what John does, but what he said this week about farmers, he basically let the cat out the bag. He said, we don't really care about farmers. We don't care about farming. Is exactly the same thing. People forget this. What he said in 2014, where he basically derided UKIP voters as being the lumpen proletariat who didn't really understand what they were voting for. Same story, 10 years later, dismissing ordinary people, saying, they're not legitimate, they don't have acceptable views, classic elite view of what's going on in the country. But they consistently forget they are outnumbered by the millions of people who live in this country. Claire was at the Manor. She says, brilliant speech. We will win in 2026. What will happen in England in 2025? I think that's going to be an interesting one. I think, obviously, the key thing is going to be watching how Reform do in both Labour and Conservative areas. What I think you need to start thinking about is, if you're trying to change the country, is how can Reform put together a coalition where it's hitting Labour in the red wall, but also hitting the Conservatives. And, I think that's going to be the real strategic challenge facing the party, because they want to be putting together a very broad, realigned electorate, a bit like Trump has been doing in the US, not just doubling down on, UKIP voters, Brexit Party voters. They want to be getting a much wider coalition together if they can. We've also got, we've got a couple of comments. Fraser Nelson, part of the elite. I've got a lot of time for some of the things Fraser writes on welfare. I think he's very good. I think he's pointing to the failures of the state. I don't agree with him where he is on immigration. And I don't agree, by the way, with where The Spectator has been on immigration. Best symbolized as well by Michael Gove backing Kamala Harris, which I thought was mind-boggling. I don't understand how a self-described conservative can support Kamala Harris, given everything that she was promoting. Is the Labour Party initiative, asks Ian, on farmers and pensions, a sinister move? I don't think it's sinister. I think it's entirely transparent. I think Labour are declaring war on the countryside. I just don't think Labour get the countryside. I don't think they understand who we are. I don't think they understand our identity. I don't think they understand people who are from the country, who live in rural communities. As I said in the speech at Wales, we are taking winter fuel payments from pensioners to save £1.5 billion. And we're smashing family farms to save £2 billion, maybe £3 billion. Okay, so let's be generous. Let's say we're doing those things to save £5 billion. But we're spanking £18 billion on our broken asylum system. Not to mention the amount we're just absolutely throwing down the drain by increasing our borrowing and debt levels. It's completely nonsensical. The other things Labour have been doing, shutting down government bodies that are looking at how to make house building and public buildings more beautiful. They have no real interest in the things that make us who we are. So for them, clamping down on family farms to try and kind of, as Clarkson said, basically trying to ethnically cleanse the countryside to make room for crap towns and social housing that's at least nearly half of which in London is occupied by people who weren't even born in the country. It's headed by households that weren't born in the country. I mean, this is how Labour fundamentally view the country. I mean, it's a terrible government, a government that I just simply do not like on any level. Can you get, sorry, there's a few other questions coming in here. Absolutely disgusting about Alison Pearson, Maya Forstater, and the guy who committed suicide in Oxford after being cancelled. Do you think this kind of thing will help turn the idea? Look, what you're seeing with Alison Pearson, if you're not aware, so the use of non-crime hate incidents, just be absolutely clear. We also learned this morning at the Times that 9-year-old pupils, children, have been dealt these non-crime hate incidents for referring to some of their fellow pupils in derogatory terms. I mean, this is positively Orwellian. I'm awaiting a visit from the police for something that I say on X or something that I say on Substack. And when that visit comes, I will be there with my phone and record the whole thing. But we need to strip out this legislation. What it is designed to do is narrow the parameters of the national conversation. So whenever you hear Sadiq Khan, who issued a completely ridiculous statement after Donald Trump's election saying, Londoners are united in rejecting hate, it's all part of an attempt to inflate the social norms that govern our national conversation, which is why, so few conservatives in this country were supportive of Trump, because, they were terrified about undermining their social status in society because of this conversation being limited. But that's what they're doing. So by expanding hate laws, by no doubt pushing a new definition of Islamophobia, by using non-hate crime incidents, it's all designed to try and control the supply of information. That is what this is about. It is about trying to make certain views appear illegitimate and appear socially unacceptable. There's a great book by Jonathan Rauch called The Constitution of Knowledge, in which he argues that the people who determine what makes knowledge, what is part of the body of knowledge that we have, well, those people are deeply unrepresentative. They do not represent societies to which they belong. So they curtail conversation, they curtail discussion in the name of beliefs that they decide represent the country. So it's a very biased, it's a very restrictive worldview. And you saw it as well with the teacher who was forced into hiding after they showed a caricature of Mohammed in Batley, when the official report after that case actually referred to this as freedom restricting harassment, where an independent report, government report, said certain people, certain members of the community were engaging in freedom restricting harassment. Okay, and we all know who those people were. But now, unfortunately, it's part of the legislative agenda. Sue says, do you agree that Trump's victory has been very instructive to the left about how you ignore the people at your peril? American elites thought they'd seen off white men and could rely on Latinos, Hispanics, African Americans, and the young, but they were wrong, because those groups want economic growth, are against culture wars, mass immigration. The good news would appear to be that our left arrogantly are not listening. Will they listen and change, do you think? So one of the most interesting points about Trump's win is it turned on its head the old narrative on the left of demography is destiny. Some of you are old enough, like me, to remember that when Barack Obama was elected, everybody on the left said, this is the future of politics. A diverse, university-educated coalition that is held together by socially liberal values. And the old, white, angry men and women are the past. The future is diversity. That was a narrative pushed by Stan Greenberg, Democrat pollster, pushed by David Aronovich, who said, well, we don't need to worry about Brexit because the old people are going to die. Polly Toynbee, who even wrote a piece in The Guardian where she was counting the number of old white people who were soon going to be dead, and therefore Brexit would become obsolete. Peter Kellner, the pollster, he did the same. Rob Ford, the academic, basically argued that Brexit is a last gasp of angry old white men. Well, I'm sorry, but they all were wrong, because if you look at what's happened with Trump's clean sweep, is actually demography is not necessarily destiny. You can win as a conservative movement while realigning your electorate. Therein is the most important message of the US election. And for people in Britain, there's a very important message here too. If you lean in to minority voters who also are sick of mass uncontrolled immigration, if you lean in to young people who are sick of the culture wars, who are sick of high tax, a crappy economy that doesn't give them a stake in the housing ladder, that doesn't give them assets, that doesn't give them property, and even worse, if you're a 30-year-old professional graduate working in London, you're basically subsidizing people who can't be bothered to go to work, who are in social housing, who are often from outside of the country, and your commute in and out of London or wherever you're working in the country is blighted by the sort of legalization of cannabis and petty crime and shoplifting. And you look around and you think, why am I paying for this social contract? Why am I actually contributing to upholding this social contract? And if you've seen the meme of Nick, the 30-year-old, I'll put it on Twitter X later on today so you can see it. But it's an absolutely ridiculous social contract that we have in this country. And that is an example of how the realignment can actually completely flip. 1 in 3 Black and minority ethnic voters in Britain voted for Brexit. We don't forget that. Many Hindu and Sikh voters are absolutely sick of what's happening to this country they love. They play by the rules. They want people to play by the rules. We want people to play by the rules. It's not that difficult. We don't want our laws to be disrespected. We don't want people to be breaking into the country illegally. We don't want small scale, or lower level crimes to be completely legitimized and mainstreamed. We don't want that to happen in this country. And I think what the Trump victory has shown is that conservatives can easily realign. And look at the age profile. I mentioned this in the piece this morning. Many European countries, national populists are often doing best among young voters. If you look at Germany, as I said this morning, in the eastern half of Germany, the AfD is the most popular party among young men. There is no age divide to Giorgia Meloni's party in Italy. She's doing just as well among the young and the old. In France, there's no real age divide. Marine Le Pen has been doing pretty well among young women, particularly women in the hospitality sector and services sector. She's even doing quite well now among gay and lesbian people, primarily because they all share a sense of dread about where Western societies are heading over the next 10, 20 years, that their hard-won rights are being undermined by mass immigration and by an unresponsive political elite. And we can all sense that, and so can a growing number of voters. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading some of your questions. Do the comments of Andrew Bailey, ask Andrew Williams, does Andrew Bailey's comments denigrating Brexit imply that Labour might dare to go for EU rejoin without even returning to the people? No, not yet, I don't think, Andrew. But what they will do is they'll soften up that relationship as much as possible, preparing the ground potentially for something after 28, 29. If Labour tried this through the back door, there would be an almighty outcry from all corners. The mood in the country is already very febrile, and it will get worse in 2025. The growth rates this morning were dire, but that wasn't because of Brexit. The growth rates being 0.1%, something like that. It's because we're in a big tax, big debt, big state, big immigration, big regulation, big bureaucracy, economic model. We've basically done the opposite of what we should have done after the Brexit referendum. We have completely removed any incentive for companies to innovate, for companies to be dynamic, for companies to move outside of London. We've given them endless amounts of cheap migrant labor, which mean they don't really have to become more productive. That's why part of the reason our GDP per capita is going backwards. We've just stifled small businesses with regulation and now more tax, including the national insurance tax uplift. And we're decimating the entrepreneurs and wealth creators and family firms from farming to small businesses that we do have. We are basically sucking the lifeblood out of our economy and creating a big state top down economy where the tax burden is now the highest that it's ever been, and the debt to GDP ratio is the highest that it's been since the Second World War. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. We have people in charge of our economy who I don't think understand how to run a dynamic, growing economy. It's completely bananas. Claire said Paris and Amsterdam are really scary right now. Could happen here soon. I agree. The images in Amsterdam of Jews being chased through the streets by sort of Palestinian supporting mobs was deeply alarming, but unsurprising. I mean, this is how depressing it is because we've seen similar scenes here in the UK, and it's very disturbing. In the Batley by-elections at Badger, none of the main party candidates dared mention the teacher or the grooming gangs. Absolutely. You will have seen the recent grooming gang case, the sentences in I think it was Rotherham. I've talked about those on my Twitter and X. We've got the farming protests. Louise is rightly pointing to. So the farming protests are happening at the end of this month. I think this is potentially a very significant moment in British politics. If you're from outside of Britain, just so you know, what's happened is the Labour government have basically announced that they're going to increase inheritance tax rates on family farms, which basically is going to bankrupt and make unsustainable farms that have passed down families for generations. And some Labour advisors and activists have basically let the cat out the bag and said, they want to do this so they can replace those farms with things like solar panels and, encourage the sort of growing, corporatization of farming, big corporates basically just dominating, and family farms, part of our national identity, part of our national DNA, are going to be decimated. And the farmers have had enough. They've had enough. They've had enough of us not exploiting the benefits and the advantages after Brexit. They've had enough of the regulation and the endless paperwork. And now they've had enough of the tax rates and being shut down. So they're going to come to London. They're going to protest en masse. I'm going to be there. I hope you're going to be there. I'm going to be with them in the streets. And I think people are wanting to push back wherever possible against this government. And we should support them. We should do whatever we can to support them, even if the official farming unions are not doing that. So come out. I'll be writing on the farming protest shortly. Jenny asks, do I feel the pressure when I'm broadcasting not to innocently say something that can have the police knocking on your door, like the recent case with Alison Pearson? Yeah, but whatever. I mean, I don't care, to be honest. If they want to come knocking, they can come knocking. I'm going to keep going. We've got some other questions coming in here. You mentioned Peter Thiel. I talked with him about the dynamics in American politics. I think he's an interesting guy. I don't know too much about his company. Sorry, 1 second. When Trump starts the deportations, it's going to show many people what is likely to come, and it's going to boost morale among the so-called deplorables, says Brian. I think actually that's true. One of the more interesting interviews during the campaign in the US was by J.D. Vance, who was asked this question. And somebody said, well, how are you going to do this? How can you possibly be doing deportations? It's completely, it's impractical. And J.D. Vance essentially said, well, if you enter America illegally, we'll start there. So if you're in the country illegally, we're going to return you to your country of origin. And if you're in American prisons and you're a foreign offender, we're going to move you out. So he was saying, look, I mean, in America, I think there are 13 million or 14 million estimated illegal migrants. And what Vance said is, look, we'll start with the million that we know about and we'll move them out. And that will discourage others from coming while finishing the wall. And I was watching that interview and I was thinking about the UK, because if you ask people in this country, do you think that foreign nationals who break the law should be removed? You will often find that between 70 and 80% of Brits will say, yeah, actually, I think if you come into the country illegally, particularly if you break the law, you should be removed. My view is if you enter illegally, you should be deported. And if you break the law while you're here, you should be deported. That's my kind of view. I think that's a pretty mainstream view, even if it isn't one in the elite class. How do you do that? Well, you start with the 147,000 people who have come on the small boats, which in fairness to Rishi Sunak is what he was trying to do, which is through the Illegal Migration Act, you basically immediately detain and deport people who arrive illegally. And you send them offshore, you send them to a processing center. In his case, it was Rwanda. He didn't quite cover the legal loopholes, which is why he was vulnerable. But we have a kind of immediate deportation of anybody who arrives illegally. That to me is like step one. That's a no-brainer. But then 11,000 people in the prisons who are here illegally, you can also deport those people as well. And there's a real, I think, straightforward way of approaching this, which is upholding support and trust for in the social contract in our institutions, also helping to deal with some of the problems that we've got in those institutions, like prisons, where we don't have space for actual criminals, but is also making it clear that we're running an effective and secure border. I mean, if you're not deporting people, you don't really have a border. So, you know, it doesn't really make much sense. So that's kind of where my view, that's what my view is on this. And just, sorry, just coming towards the end here. I'm just trying to look at your questions. Theo, Nigel Farage just said no to remigration. Do you think he'll have to change his view? I don't actually think that is what Nigel said, to be honest. I think he was just saying that it's too loose just to talk about deportations. You need to define what you're talking about. And I agree with him on that. I don't think he was saying people, you know, if you arrive illegally on a small boat, you shouldn't be removed. He wasn't saying that. He was just saying if you just say deportations generally, you need to be specific about what you're talking about. Kate, look who's supporting the Farmers' March. GB News, Reform, unions, me. Starmer's going to be worried, and he should be worried. This protest is going to be enormous. One second. How can we get an early general election? Petronella. I don't think we can. I think the only thing we can do is campaign hard at every election contest there is. Local elections, Welsh Assembly elections, by-elections, holding the government to account, which we're doing on things like immigration data, information, the farmers' protests. We're in opposition mode, building the oppositional ecosystem, contributing to alternative TV channels, alternative networks. We're not minimizing our voice, we're maximizing our voice, and we're not going anywhere. And take comfort from the direction of travel that is happening elsewhere. I think there was something unique and freak-like about the 2024 general election in the sense that there was no public endorsement. There was no public support for this Labour government. There was no public support for it, which sounds perverse to say, given the majority. But if you look at, you know, the share of people who actually voted for Labour was very low. The combined share of support for the two main parties was the lowest for a very long time. And it was a punishment election. It was a rejection of the Conservative Party that left Labour as the only alternative to that. In 28-29, that will not be the case. In 28-29, there will be a significant, meaningful alternative to the two main parties. I genuinely believe that. I really think that is going to be the case. And I think it's going to be a lot broader, more professional and more compelling than what we've seen previously. But until then, it's a case of actually just focusing on the elections that we have and focusing on the alternatives that we have. Jenny says, I grew up on a family farm. Thank you for supporting us. Absolutely. If Reform win the Welsh elections, can we change the inheritance tax for Welsh farmers, says Claire. I need to, good question. I need to look at that. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think we'd be able to. I need to check the tax powers of the Welsh Parliament, but it would certainly give those of us who oppose it a lot more lobbying power. Jeremy Clarkson, would he stand for reform? Would this threaten the Tories? Jeremy Clarkson won't stand for reform, would be my bet, because I don't think he would want to be drawn into party politics to that extent. I think Jeremy Clarkson is an incredibly useful voice and figure. He can cut through in a way that very few celebrities can, and he can legitimize particular viewpoints that other people can't quite say, but then can point to Clarkson and say, actually, I think he's got a point. So he is very useful. I'm skeptical about looking to celebrities for political solutions. I think they're much better at changing the weather. They're better at changing the mood, but I don't think they're very good at practical politics. I don't think Jeremy Clarkson, given a political party, would be the future to all of our problems. In some ways, he might just be the enabler of more problems. I think we have to work with people who have a track record of consistently standing up against the liberal establishment and who have a serious plan for how they want to change that establishment. And I'm sure Jeremy Clarkson's a nice guy, but I don't think he is that person. But he's useful in society. So thanks for that, Andrew. It's strange that you always refer, as Jean Bernard said, you always refer to Marine Le Pen and Bardella as though Eric Zemmour and his party Reconquest do not exist. It's a shame because they're proposing really interesting things for the country and for Europe. Okay, I think Eric Zemmour is he's an interesting figure. We've had lunch, we've met before. I think he's got interesting ideas, but the French political system is fundamentally different from what we're operating in Britain. You have European Parliament elections. You have, you have a different system for electing representatives where people on both the right and the left from smaller parties can have a considerable influence. I think in France as well, you have the tradition of public intellectuals influencing the national conversation in a much bigger way than we do in Britain, although some of us are trying to change that. And were we to have a smaller party on either the left or the right, they would struggle for space in British politics. They struggle for publicity. They struggle for impact, which is why I came to the view that really there is actually only one alternative to the two big parties. And even if you think that Bessel is imperfect, it is the only alternative to the two big parties. And just lastly, sorry, in the last couple of minutes here, how will Labour react to Trump's policies, Matthew says, which are going to be the polar opposite of their own? Will they have to soften their approach, or will they try and side with the EU? I do suspect that one impact of the Trump presidency will be that it pushes Labour closer to the EU model and trying to say, actually, we're more instinctively in line with Europe than we are with America, which would be the wrong move for us. I would just say, I think we need to be closer to America than Europe. I think Europe is divided. It's sluggish. It's inefficient. It's got terrible political leadership. It's consistently made the wrong decisions on energy, to protectionism, to immigration. I think we are so much better off out here in Britain, and we should be fulfilling our historic role of trying to be between these two powers, and if anything, be closer to America than the European Union, which I don't personally think is a democratic organization. So I think Labour will respond by getting nudged closer to Europe, which will be a mistake. It's going to be interesting to see who the main go-between will be between Labour and Trump. I do think Nigel Farage is now in a much stronger position than he was 2 weeks ago. I think his credibility and his influence has gone through the roof. He is somebody who can walk between America and Brexit Britain in a way that very few politicians can. Not even Boris can. Boris doesn't have the connections that Nigel has in the US. So I think that's important. And Labour are going to have to really get over their instinctive hostility to to the new president of the United States, which is still just a great thing to say. Mashima says thanks, looking forward to the Christmas party. Me too. We've actually sold all of the tickets now. We're raising money for charity, who the Veterans Housing Association will be with us on the night, so they will be there with us celebrating, and that's a great thing to be able to raise some money for charity as well. And we've run out of time today. Thank you for tuning in. I will be seeing you next week. There's a lot to come over the next week. Some updates on the information campaign. We've got a lot of stuff in the pipeline to come out on some of the key issues that have been in the news recently. Some questions I haven't managed to get to, but we'll make a note of all the questions we didn't come to, and we will return to some of those and make sure we touch on them in the pieces. But it's been a really active, busy, successful week again, we connected with thousands of people over the last week, which has been really, really positive. And have a great weekend to you and your families. And I hope that I hope you guys have a great time. I will catch you next week. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon.